This is St. Louis Public Radio. Support comes from Para Corporation, a general contractor seeking professionals who want to make a difference in the community. More at parac.com/careers.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the hour, we'll talk with two state lawmakers who formed a caucus looking at big problems that could dominate our future, particularly around the rise of artificial intelligence and how states will have to respond to natural disasters. But first, I want to introduce you to Crystal Lyon. She's a Forestdale resident and the mother of a delightful 18-month-old baby named Ari. Both Lyon and her daughter have recently been on Medicaid, a program that helps connect low-income workers, people with disabilities, and older adults to healthcare services. Lyon says Medicaid wasn't just helpful for her daughter, it saved her life. Shortly after Ari was born, doctors diagnosed her with a rare form of eye cancer. Thanks to Medicaid paying for much of the treatments, Lyon was able to access some of the leading eye doctors in the St. Louis region.
They took such great care of my daughter. And even now, when we go to the specialty care centers for her eye exams, they sing to her and they let her bring her stuffies back. And every time they bring her little Elmo stuffy back, he always has an eye patch on like she does. And it's just, they're amazing.
Ari, by the way, is doing much better now. But it probably won't surprise you that Lyon closely followed the legislative trajectory of what lawmakers dubbed the One Big Beautiful Bill. Now it's more accurate to call it the One Big Beautiful Law, since President Donald Trump signed it on July 4th. There are so many different provisions in this law that it's unclear how it will affect Lyon or her family right away. But she's deeply concerned about how two controversial components could affect roughly 1.2 million Missourians on Medicaid. One would require some recipients to either work or try to find employment. The other would sharply limit a tax on medical providers, such as hospitals, that Missouri and other states use to help pay for the program. Lyon worries that other Missourians won't have the financial peace of mind she had when her daughter was going through the most difficult parts of her illness.
So I think instead of cutting Medicaid, we need to put more money into it. There is kids like my daughter who are at the end of their life and their parents, I've seen it happen. They have to sit there and hold their kid's hand and tell them that it's okay to go and tell them to shut their eyes and that they love them. And then on top of it, they have to deal with medical bills. And I don't think that any parent who has gone through such a trying journey should have to pay medical bills while also paying for a funeral and burying their little kid. I think that that's just awful.
Healthcare experts and practitioners warn that the Big Beautiful Bill's Medicaid changes will result in fewer people having access to the program and a financial hollowing out of struggling hospitals in rural Missouri.
We're not the smallest of the smalls. We're not the biggest of the bigs. We're kind of right in the middle.
That's Craig Thompson, the president and CEO of Golden Valley Memorial Healthcare. Thompson's healthcare system is based in Clinton, Missouri, about 75 miles southeast of Kansas City, and it serves about 80,000 people in rural counties, which include a lot of Medicaid and Medicare recipients. Leaders of Missouri hospitals have embraced medical provider taxes for years. They contend that it allows Missouri to have a financially solvent Medicaid program, which in turn means that hospitals will get compensated enough by the state to provide care for enrollees. The Big Beautiful Bill would cap medical provider taxes at 3.5% by 2032. For context, Missouri's medical provider tax is currently at 4.2%, but has gone as high as close to 6%. And healthcare experts worry that the shortfall caused by this cap will prompt state lawmakers to either spend less money on education or pay places like hospitals less money to care for Medicaid patients. Thompson says that working people have a lot to lose if the big beautiful bill ends up hurting the financial viability of rural hospitals.
One of the things that I do hope comes from all this deliberation around Medicaid and this discussion is that we put a face to the Medicaid program. There's this perception, and it's misplaced, that Medicaid beneficiaries are despondent, lazy, people who are just out taking advantage of the government. Well, I can tell you, in the rural community that I serve, that is not the case. Medicaid recipients are farmers, they're ranchers, they're small business owners, they're veterans, and it's a whole bunch of kids. And to think that those individuals want to be on Medicaid, that is not the case. But for many, Medicaid is the resource they have to access healthcare services.
Ultimately, the federal budgetary package included $50 billion to help hospital systems like Golden Valley Memorial Healthcare. But whether that's enough to offset the loss of state revenue when the medical provider restrictions go into effect is still an open question. While Republicans disagreed greatly over whether to curb medical provider taxes, GOP lawmakers were far more united on requiring Medicaid recipients to prove they're working, in school, or doing community service. Here's Missouri Congressman Jason Smith of Salem.
It's about restoring sanity in a town that's lost it, cutting waste and reining in reckless spending. It demands that if you're able to work, you should. It stops asking working families to foot the bill for Washington's bad decisions.
States like Missouri will have a couple of years to figure out how the work requirements will, work. But Heidi Lucas isn't optimistic that they'll be intuitive for Missourians who need Medicaid. Lucas is with the Missouri Rural Health Association, and in the past, Lucas was a caseworker who signed people up for temporary assistance for needy families, another federal aid program that's run by states which does have a work requirement.
For them to fulfill what the work requirements required was next to impossible. So, you live in a small town, how many places are there for you to actually apply for? And what are those requirements going to be? How many places do you have to apply for in a week, in a month? We don't know all of those details yet, but there's only so many places for people to apply for. So what happens when you exhaust all of those? These are people, they want to work. Folks who aren't working, they want to work. They want to provide a better living for their family.
Getting the big, beautiful bill to Trump wasn't easy, as it passed in both the Senate and the House by very narrow margins. North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis joined two other GOP senators in voting no, primarily because of fears that the Medicaid provisions could plunge states into financial and administrative uncertainty.
We owe it to the states to do the work to understand how these proposals affect them. How hard is that? I did it.
For a time, it appeared that Missouri Senator Josh Hawley could have been a no vote. He penned an op-ed for the New York Times calling efforts to cut Medicaid, quote, morally wrong and politically suicidal. He also talked with reporters about it in March at an annual gathering of Missouri Republicans.
I'm not going to vote for Medicaid benefit cuts. Now, they want to do work requirements. I'm all for that. I think that's fantastic. But I'm not going to vote for something that ends up cutting benefits for people who are working and who qualify for Medicaid. 21% of Missouri families are either on Medicaid or CHIP. And we're talking about 1.5 million people. So I'm just not going to do that. And I've made that very clear. If they want to do that, they can do that without my vote.
Hawley ended up voting yes on the bill, and that prompted some commentators, especially on the political left, to paint Hawley as a flimsy paper tiger who doesn't back up his grand pronouncements with action. But at a press conference in Hazelwood this week celebrating the revival and expansion of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, Hawley noted that the medical provider tax curbs, which could prompt states to scale back Medicaid coverage, don't go fully into effect until 2032.
So there's a lot of work to do on this. I think it's a mistake to cut Medicaid. I've always said that. I continue to believe it. We have prevented it from happening in Missouri for the rest of this decade and, in fact, got an increase in funding. But I'm going to dedicate myself with all the urgency I've dedicated myself to this fight, to seeing that in the 2030s and beyond, there are no Medicaid cuts that take effect in Missouri.
Crystal Lyon, the St. Charles County mom with a child on Medicaid, is not impressed with Hawley's decision-making. She says she strongly supports the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, known as RECA. That law provides health care and financial assistance to people who develop certain illnesses because of radioactive waste exposure. But she contends the potential damage to Medicaid isn't worth it.
I am all for giving the RECA victims funding. I think that is wonderful. They deserve it. But I think that standing in front of people and justifying it that way is very sad. Because it's not just like he wants to say the able-bodied people that are playing video games in their mother's basement. It's kids like my daughter. It's those RECA victims that are probably on Medicare and Medicaid who need hospitals and they need health care. And I just think that it's sad that our senator can do that to us.
There's still time for lawmakers like Hawley to reverse some of the more contentious aspects of the big, beautiful bill. But there's little question what lawmakers ended up passing will affect how low-income workers access health care. And joining us now to break down the One Big Beautiful Bill's impact on Medicaid is Sarah Fentem, who covers health care for St. Louis Public Radio. Sarah, welcome.
Hello.
Before we dive deep into the weed of these complex policy issues, what did you think of Crystal Lyon's sentiments about the Big Beautiful Bill's Medicaid provisions?
Two things really stick out to me, which is she's talking about her child. And as we heard in the top of the show, something like half of Missouri Medicaid recipients, there are 1.2 million of them here, are children. And the second thing I'm listening to her is she's talking about how there's this conception of people on Medicaid as moochers and people who are too lazy to work. And you know, it's a big country and a ton of people are on Medicaid. I'm sure there are people that are like playing video games and receiving benefits. But when you look at the big picture data, it shows that's a very small piece of the Medicaid pie. Something like 10% of people on Medicaid are actually just not working for a reason other than, you know, caregiving, or they're trying to find work, or they're injured or that kind of thing. And so the vast majority of Medicaid recipients are actually working.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll continue our conversation with St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Fentem about how the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill will affect Missouri's Medicaid program. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. We're continuing our conversation with St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Fentem on the future of Missouri's Medicaid program after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill. And I wanted to focus more on Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, who we heard from earlier in the program. Before voting yes on the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, Hawley criticized Republicans who wanted to make deep Medicaid cuts, but ended up voting for a measure that could eventually prompt states to rein in their programs. New York Times columnist Frank Bruni wrote that this week that Hawley's vote for the Big Beautiful Bill continues, quote, the arc of Republican lawmakers in the Trump era bending toward complete submission. Sarah, I understand that you spoke with the senator this week. What did he tell you about why he ended up voting for the One Big Beautiful Bill?
Yeah, as you said, he was a no, and then he was a yes. And Senator Hawley mentioned an amendment that adds an estimated $1 billion for rural Missouri hospitals to offset losses they could face. That's called the Rural Hospital Transformation Fund.
We were able in this bill to delay any changes to rural hospital funding, and not just that, but to get an increase in rural hospital funding over the next 4 years. That's $1 billion for Missouri's rural hospitals, and they need that money right now. So I'm glad we'll be getting that money. I think that's going to be very helpful over the next 4 years. And that gives me time and others who are like-minded time to make sure that any future cuts do not go into effect. I'm opposed to cutting funding for rural hospitals. I'm opposed to Medicaid benefit cuts, of which there are none in this bill. So make no mistake, I'm going to fight any changes regarding rural hospital funding in the future. I want to make sure that no cuts to rural hospitals ever go into effect for Missouri or frankly any other state.
Now, when Hawley says there's no Medicaid benefit cuts in this bill, I suppose that's true in the sense that it doesn't reduce what the Medicaid program will actually provide to enrollees. But isn't it possible that fewer people will have access to Medicaid when this bill goes into effect?
That's what people are saying. So a big thing the bill does is it adds a lot of documentation and eligibility requirements to Medicaid. A lot of people who have been following this bill have heard about work requirements for people between 19 and 64. And states will soon have to verify patients' eligibility for Medicaid more often, twice a year instead of once a year. And so what that does is not only limit who's eligible, but it requires a lot of verification and documentation, states going back and forth with Medicaid recipients. And we've seen in the past, that's where a lot of people actually drop off, not necessarily because they're not eligible to receive benefits, but because their address hasn't been updated or they don't fill out a form correctly. Applying for these benefits can be a lot of work and a lot of paperwork and a lot of bureaucratic wrangling and navigation. And so, make one mistake or you miss a deadline and you're off the rolls. And we've seen that in the past. And that could eventually end up dropping a lot of people off the rolls, whether they're eligible or not.
Crystal Lyon, the St. Charles County mom whose daughter benefited from Medicaid paid health care, said that it wasn't worth it to vote for the One Big Beautiful Bill just because it had a program to help people who became sick because of radioactive waste exposure. You actually asked Hawley basically that exact question. What did he say?
Yeah, why did you vote for something that eventually you'll have to reverse in the future? And he said he's really focused on making sure these cuts don't happen. They have a few years before they go into effect, and he's really focused on making sure that in that time he fights to make sure that they don't actually get cut.
Yeah, well, we were able to ensure that there are no Medicaid benefit cuts in this bill whatsoever, which was a red line for me. And this bill does not change the federal government's contribution to Medicaid for Missouri or any other state, which is outstanding. We were able to delay any changes to the rural hospital funding. In fact, we were able to get an increase for rural hospitals in Missouri of $1 billion over the next 4 years. And my view is that that's pretty good, and RECA is of the highest importance. But I'll tell you, when it comes to Medicaid, I'm opposed to cutting Medicaid funding for rural hospitals. Missouri's going to see an increase in rural hospital funding over the next 4 years, but I am committed to ensuring that there are no future cuts to Medicaid rural hospitals. I know many of my colleagues want that. Many of them proposed it. Many of them want to see the prospective cuts in this bill go into effect. I do not. So I will be doing everything I can to ensure that rural hospitals are not cut, that their funding is not cut, and that there are no Medicaid benefit cuts in Missouri going forward.
So I cannot read Josh Hawley's mind, but what he's talking about there almost certainly is a number of his Republican colleagues are very critical of medical provider taxes, which are taxes on places like hospitals and pharmacies that help states pay for Medicaid. For instance, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina called them a scam that allows states to bilk the federal government out of more money. And Idaho Senator Mike Crapo called it a funding gimmick. Did Hawley find any validity in his colleagues' opinions?
Yeah, I asked him about that, and the answer is no. He thinks it's baloney.
I mean, my view is that this is a way that the states have legally and totally above board chosen to fund their contribution to Medicaid. I mean, listen, what would they prefer? I mean, my colleagues who say they don't like this, would they prefer that that homeowners be taxed more? Would they prefer that we have higher energy taxes? I mean, how do they want to raise the money? I just think that this is a silly argument. The truth is the states have been using provider taxes for years, and the bottom line is this: we should not be cutting funding for rural hospitals, period. We should not be doing it. It is a mistake. It is the wrong thing to do. And that's why I emphasize Missouri is going to see an increase in funding for rural hospitals over the next 4 years. And that will give us time to stop any future cuts going forward. I'm totally opposed to cutting funding for rural hospitals.
Now, we've heard Hawley talk multiple times about the increase in funding for rural hospitals, and that is a clear reference to this $50 billion fund that was added when the Senate was passing the big, beautiful bill. What exactly will this money go to? And do the people you talk to feel like it will be worth it, especially with these potentially stark medical provider tax cuts?
Right. This was something that was written into the bill in the final days, that it was going back and forth in D.C. And it's a $50 billion, something called the Rural Hospital. I forget what H word it is, but it's a $50 billion fund that's going to all 50 states to help offset these potential losses that they're going to see. And so, as we've heard Hawley say on the program today, that is an estimated about $1 billion for Missouri. And so I asked Heidi Lucas, who we heard earlier, about this, and she's, $1 billion is a lot of money, but hospitals also cost a lot of money. And so when you're looking at $1 billion over a few years for rural hospitals, how much does that actually do? And I asked Hawley, I said, okay, what happens after 2030 when this fund runs out? And it was very like, well, we'll keep the cuts from going into effect. And so the question is, $1 billion is great, especially for rural hospitals, but is it enough to offset these losses, especially if it doesn't end up, if people aren't successful in keeping these other cuts from going into effect? What she said is just basically is kicking the inevitable down the road.
Now, we've talked a lot about how Missouri and other states could face a lot of financial hardship because of the medical provider tax restrictions. The Missouri Hospital Association says it could cost the state hundreds of millions of dollars if they fully go into effect by 2032. But Robert Kasner, a research professor at the University of Chicago, is not terribly sympathetic to this argument, especially given states like Missouri have done since the COVID-19 pandemic.
The largesse that came out of the pandemic payments have been long lasting for states. And most states have been cutting taxes, right? So the states have the taxing potential. It's not like they've been raising taxes. They've been cutting taxes on average. Their budgets are looking good. The federal government has been supporting them generously for the last several years. So I also think states are in a little better position now, especially with the long runway they've been given again, to put their Medicaid and state budgets on a better footing, more transparent for sure.
That was Robert Kasner, a research professor at the University of Chicago, talking about some of the financial impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill. Sarah, does Robert have a point there? I mean, Missouri has cut taxes a couple of times since the pandemic when they got all this money. Isn't it kind of a self-inflicted wound that they may be dealing with some of these hardships going forward?
I think, like, as a health reporter, the pandemic has been really complicated when it comes to looking at how all of this funding ends up shaking out, because a lot of this is sort of like one-time payments, right? And so when you look at those one-time payments, how hardy is that funding for different, state activities? You know, like it's not a continuing source of help.
Now, Hawley said multiple times throughout your interview that he would try to prevent things like the medical provider tax curves from going into effect. And he's not alone in wanting that. Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe also wants Congress to reverse course.
In Missouri, we've handled it very responsibly, as you've seen. We've had the percentage go up and down, so to only use what we need. And I'm a fan of that model. I think we've used it effectively, and credit to our hospital and our hospital association. They've really done a good job of making sure we don't take advantage of it. We use it to fit Missourians the best.
That was Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe talking about why he supports medical provider taxes. Now, Sarah, I've heard politicians say forever that after something they don't like passes, that they're going to work really hard to reverse it. How many times have you heard from Republicans saying they were going to reverse the Affordable Care Act in the last 15 years?
Right.
Are Missouri Republicans engaging in wishful thinking here, or do you think that it is possible to reverse course, especially if there's a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president in 2029 or something?
I think, as we saw with the passage of this bill, and all of the compromising and the arm twisting and the wrangling that you had to get through to get this particular one even, rammed through Congress, it's hard to get past any big reforms like this. And then I feel like it's even harder to repeal stuff once it's actually in place. And so I think it's a question of sort of putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Can you do it? Maybe. Is it going to be messy and a lot of work? Yes.
It is often very messy to put toothpaste back in tubes.
Yes.
But on that note, Sarah Fentem is St. Louis Public Radio's health reporter. Sarah, thank you so much for being here today.
Anytime.
When we return, we'll talk with two Missouri state lawmakers who helped create a caucus that they hope will deal head-on with some daunting long-term challenges. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. In the dynamic and frenetic world of Missouri politics, policymakers often focus on immediate issues rather than problems that may spring up far into the future. And that's understandable. If political leaders sat around thinking about things that could happen as opposed to what's happening right now, they'd likely be so riddled with anxiety and worry, they'd be unable to do their jobs. But a bipartisan group of Missouri House members are taking a step back and planning a bit for the future. State Representatives Colin Wellenkamp, a Republican from St. Charles County, and Marty Joe Murray, a Democrat from St. Louis, are part of a 5-member Future Caucus. And they're trying to get a handle on really difficult topics, like how state government should regulate artificial intelligence and how Missouri may need to prepare for less federal help to deal with natural disasters. Wellenkamp and Murray join me in studio right now. Representatives, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, yeah, thank you.
Representative Wellenkamp, what is the Future Caucus and why does it exist?
Sure. Good question. So the Speaker of the House, John, he decided that he had been hearing from a lot of the standing committees of the House that there were a lot of issues out there that were a little bit further afield than the Emerging Issues Committee that is chaired by Brad Christ, and Brad's doing a great job with that. But there were these continuing drone of issues kind of hitting the state that had some complexity to them, and they were already in the news. You mentioned two of them already in your opening, AI and disaster preparedness. And he could see that these were coming down the pike, and as they were getting closer and closer to being ripe enough for legislative action, they were getting more and more technical. And the standing committees, he could see, would need some assistance in assimilating and digesting some of these issues, and wanted to get ahead of the game a little bit, wanted to put Missouri on, at least on the House side, on some solid footing, so that we could start looking at these things and really help the committees be an advanced team for our standing committees before they were kind of hit in the face with just a lot of legislative proposals. So he decided, we're going to put together a future caucus. Other states have done similar approaches, and that's our mandate. Our mandate is to really look at the landscape, of issues coming before the state before they turn into legislation that the standing committees have to deal with, and really begin to take them apart, prioritize them, and make them a knowledge-based background where we can really begin to treat them legislatively in the House.
We want to hear from you. What's a long-term issue that you'd like to see the Missouri General Assembly tackle right now? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can send us an email at talk@stlpr.org. Now, Representative Wellenkamp, before you were a state representative, you were the executive director of the Missouri River Cities and Towns Initiative. You still hold...
It's the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, by the way.
Yes, Mississippi River. Thank you for correcting me. I don't know how to read today.
That's okay.
You are the executive director of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. You still hold that position today.
Yeah.
And that may give you a unique insight to talk about one of the first issues the Future Caucus is tackling, how Missouri plans to deal with natural disasters at a time when the federal government could step back from providing meaningful assistance. This seems like a pretty daunting challenge, to put it mild.
Yeah. So in that work, the Mississippi River Corridor has seen its share of disaster impacts since 2005. So since Hurricane Katrina, the Mississippi River Corridor has sustained over $250 billion in actual losses, and that is just in the counties adjacent to the Mississippi River itself. I'm not talking about the bill for the entire state that touches the main stem Mississippi. That's just next to the water. So that's a significant economic loss that we have dealt with. The most expensive of which have been in the form of droughts. Droughts and intense heat are not as big news getters because you don't necessarily see the destruction in front of your face so clearly as you would a flood or a major storm event or a hurricane. But I'll just give you an example. The 2012 50-year drought cost our nation $35 billion in actual losses. This was a Mississippi River Corridor drought. And the largest and longest inland river flood in U.S. history was the 2019 Mississippi River flood. It was a basin-wide event. Areas flooded from Pennsylvania all the way to Oklahoma, from Wisconsin all the way to Louisiana. Huge, massive flood that lasted 9 months. And the total bill for that was $20.1 billion. So that just gives you a sort of an example of how much more destructive and how much more reverberation that a drought can have in the economy than a flood. And these events just, you've been through them, Jason. You've seen them. They're stacking up. They're being more persistent. We seem to break a record every year now. You remember 1993 flood, right? The 1993 flood.
I was 9 and living in Illinois, but yes, I do. I am familiar with that, but continue.
I was standing in Old Town St. Charles when water was actually coming up onto the street during that flood. And those events would happen every 25 to 30 years. Now, events like that, where they're record-breaking in nature and they have long-lasting effects, are once every year, once every couple of years, or they don't stop. They last all year long.
Now, Representative Murray, disaster relief was something that became a not-so-future issue after the May 16th tornado in St. Louis. What sort of things did you see from this natural disaster that showed why the state may need to be more proactive in how they prepare and respond to disasters?
Right. So the thing that I saw, as the tornado came through and ripped through, ravaged the community, what made me realize that the state of Missouri needs to focus is looking at how the federal government and delayed response or the expected response from FEMA. And I know overall, like at a national level, there's a push to say it's the state's responsibility, and I feel like we felt that. Whether that be the city of St. Louis having to step up with the RAM settlement funding, with the state of Missouri having to come into a special session to react to it. I think that's just something that showed me that moving into the future, if we have more of these natural disasters throughout the state, that we'll have to just look in the mirror to see what we're going to do about it.
Someone I know who used to work for a Missouri-based member of Congress made a compelling case to me that if the federal government gave states like, I don't know, $2 to $5 billion each year for disasters, and the state agencies were responsible for doling out that relief money if there's a flood or tornado or an earthquake or a drought, that could be more efficient than what we have now, which is frankly a very slow process, even from a historical standpoint. I'll ask you first, Representative Murray, what do you think of that idea?
I like the idea as far as it just being there and knowing that it's something that we can tap into. But when I look at the long-term effects of like what natural disasters can be year in and year out, I don't know that that'll be the best approach. I think when we look at climate change, the results of the policies that are made in D.C. affect that. So I don't think it's enough for them to just put it on the states and say, we're only going to cut you give you $5 and you all can figure it out.
And Representative Wellenkamp, I think that where that idea will fall flat is if the federal government just decides not to give states money. Yeah. And then it's just basically like you're on your own.
Yeah.
And then that's not going to help anybody, because we've seen from this tornado that without significant federal assistance, people will not be able to rebuild their homes.
Yeah.
So what do you think of this idea with the caveat that it needs to come with a lot of money from the federal government?
Sure. Well, a couple things on that. I'm not opposed to the states taking a larger role in disaster relief, restoration, recovery, as well as mitigation and resilience. I agree with the president that that's probably a good idea, but the resources need to fall behind it. And FEMA plays a critical role in coordinating disaster relief disbursement because it's multi-state in nature. Rarely does a disaster confine itself to a state. There's usually more than one involved, and the FEMA plays referee, and it works with and coordinates between multiple states in responding to an event. That's one. Over 40% of FEMA's budget goes to paperwork and administrative costs. So if you were to give each state $2 billion, for instance, well, be prepared for 40% of that upwards to be eaten up by a larger administrative system that now the state would be saddled with determining eligibility and other such things.
Peter in Phelps County called in to say that he would like to see the legislature address climate change. Quote, nothing else matters except for that. Representative Murray, what do you think of Peter's comment?
I think Peter is awesome. And thank you for the question or the statement. I think that's something that's on the forefront. I think we mentioned it last time. What you look at how Tornado Alley has shifted. And I think, like I said, the policies that we enact at the federal level have impacts. And if we don't do something soon, then we'll all have to figure it out.
Representative Wellenkamp, you're a Republican, but you're also an environmental lawyer, and you're well versed in environmental issues. Do you think that people in your party realize the looming danger of something like climate change?
They do, whether you call it climate change or not. Actually, I don't care what you call it, but these disasters are facing us right now. You can't deny that May 16th event, Marty and I agreed that was a record-breaking event. Talked with the mayor. She agrees it's a record-breaking event. We just had a 1,000-year rain event here in St. Louis in July of 2022. Like I said, we had the longest and largest flood in United States history in 2019. We had a 200-year rain event in 2016. We had a 30-year drought. We had 3 years of drought, Jason. 2022 through 2025 was 3 years of drought. That all had an economic impact across our state's economies, from agriculture to manufacturing to the drinking water economy to our drinking water security. So I honestly don't care what you call it. These impacts are happening. We've got to get ahead of them, and we have to have multiple solutions on the table that mitigate and make our state more resilient. And I can tell you that the solutions do not start and stop with
that was going to be my next question. What are some other states doing when it comes to disaster response? I'm sure that both of you are looking to your colleagues elsewhere in
Sure.
state legislatures?
So it really depends on where that state is. So if that state is on the coast, your attention, for instance, Miami's state, Miami and Florida's disaster mitigation apparatus, same with Louisiana. They're very, very focused on hurricanes. They're very, very focused on named storms, ocean level rise, and flood surge. If you're more closer to the west, like the Dakotas or Nebraska, you're really worried about drought, 24/7. Drought and intense heat on your agricultural economy, which feeds your manufacturing economy. Here in Missouri, we kind of get a little of it all. We have to be prepared for, we have to be a jack of all trades. We have to be prepared for the droughts, intense heat. We've had our first wildfires over the last couple of years. Never had to deal with wildfires in Missouri before. And we have some significant storm events, not hurricanes, but we've had some serious storms with very destructive floodwater.
And also earthquakes in southeast Missouri.
Southeast Missouri, yeah, the New Radford Fault Line, absolutely. Yeah.
One of the other issues that the Future Caucus is looking into is artificial intelligence. So let me be really upfront here. I think that some AI things like the Otter transcription service are fantastic. I love being able not to transcribe my audio by longhand, and I fully endorse that. But as a journalist who does not like to see my work stolen, I am very, 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 very alarmed that many AI systems are being built with copyrighted material, often without payment to news outlets, our authors, our creators of that original work. So, Representative Murray, how do we balance the desire for innovation while also protecting people's intellectual property?
I think that's part of it, right? That's, in my mind, when Colin or Representative Wellenkamp reached out about the Futures Caucus, it takes policymakers to come in and put in those guardrails that don't exist today, right? Like, I mean, most people, you can download an app. An app is, like you say, pulling from intellectual property from people across the spectrum, whether that's in art or visual design or music. You just see it kind of touching everywhere. So, like, having those rights, where you can maintain it, because at the end of the day, you can always reverse engineer an algorithm to see where it actually pulls the information from. And then, I don't know if they create like digital keys of some kind that can tie back to compensate the people where that information is coming from. So
we're talking with State Representatives Colin Wellenkamp and Marty Jo Murray about the Future Caucus and some of the issues that lawmakers may have to deal with in the future. Now, the whole question of whether states or the federal government should even regulate AI is actually really top of mind right now. I was listening to a podcast recently with former Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban. He has recently sold the team. He's just a guy now that, has lots of money. He made the argument that federal and state governments should stay out of the way of AI, especially since countries like China are investing tons of money in it. What do you think about that?
My first thought is a businessman is the one telling you that. So, like, of course, they're going to say that the policymakers or, lawmakers should stay out of the way, I mean, especially from a perspective of innovation, not inhibiting innovation. But I don't think that's enough to say that you should step back just because you don't want to stifle innovation or you want to be able to keep pace with China.
And Representative Wellenkamp, I don't think Cuban's point is wholly invalid, but I just think completely unfettered and unregulated AI brings about the possibility of bad actors using the technology to scam people. Or, God forbid, they create an AI system that, kills everybody in the world, which you laugh.
Yeah, no,
but that's a real scenario. Yeah. Like, one scenario I've heard is somebody says make as many paper clips as possible, and then the AI system kills everything on Earth because they have atoms in there. So, isn't that a good case for government regulation of these things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm typically a proponent for government having a discrete role in things, especially when it comes to a free market and business. However, it is our job as elected officials to protect the public interest, and AI has tremendous potential. It really does. We were just in doing modeling of storms and major disaster events, AI has really changed the game and how we're able to do climate forecasting and modeling for how big is an event going to be and how potentially destructive is a storm going to be, or how big of a flood or a heat wave is going to be. So, and AI in the biotech area. Now, what we're able to do with AI and bioinformatics to map out more effective drugs and medications and treatments for disease, thanks to AI, we'll actually be able to create personal cancer treating cocktails that are personally adapted to your genome and your genetics so that they actually work. These are great things. However, like any wonderful tool, it can also be abused and misused and used for nefarious purposes. And that's where us as protectors of the public interest, we have to step in and put guardrails in and make sure that it isn't going to be used. But, Marty and I we are not data scientists, unless you have a background I'm not aware of.
I do have a background you're not aware of.
Okay, well there you go. I am not. I'll speak for myself.
Do you think that your colleagues know how big of a deal AI could be and how it has implications for government in the future?
I feel like they're seeing it. I mean, even if you don't have that type of a background or you don't professionally work in data science or AI, I think it's reaching us in ways that you didn't expect before, whether that be throwing a picture into an chat GPT or whatever other model, and you can make it do whatever you want it to look like. Even the videos that I've been seeing online, like, it's hard to tell what's real now. And my dad absolutely wouldn't be able to tell you what's real. You show him a video on the phone, he was like, wow, that really happened. But I think that becomes very dangerous in a lot of different ways, especially when you look at presidential elections or federal elections. I think that we'll have to look at it from that perspective as well.
I want to pose a closing question to both of you. The Missouri House Future Caucus is asking legislators to plan for the future rather than just react to some short-term problem. How difficult is that when there's so much pressure to pass what's in front of you? Representative Murray, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to be forward-looking, which is why I think it's great that we're starting now, because we don't have those bills right in front of us, and we can spend a little bit more time to bring the subject matter experts in, have those deep dive public hearings where we can really talk about things and not have all those external factors putting pressure on us.
Representative Wellenkamp, how important is it to plan in the future, even though you may be distracted by short-term issues right now?
Sure, and we want the Future Caucus to be that element that ensures that what does eventually get in front of the lawmaker to consider is a more informed piece of legislation, that we've been able to digest and examine cybersecurity, AI, regenerative agriculture, disaster resilience, and preparedness at a much deeper level, bringing in comparisons from what other states are doing across the country, even what other countries are doing across the world, so that what is presented in front of you is a better piece of legislation that's more informed.
And there's 5 members of the Future Caucus now. Do you think it could expand to more people?
Oh, sure. The Speaker Patterson has said that it can certainly expand. Me as the chair, I certainly I welcome expansion. We just kind of recruited 5 folks that were interested in this to be with us from all 4 corners of the state.
And bipartisan too.
Yep. Bipartisan too.
And I guess even though this is a very Republican state now, you never know. 20 years into the future, Representative Murray could be the speaker not 20 years, because you'd be termed out by then. 6 years into the future, you could be Speaker of the House by then.
We got a lot of work to do then.
I guess in the 30 seconds we have left, we talked about AI, we talked about disaster preparedness. What's another issue that you would want to focus on?
So for me, I think a big part of it, and it kind of ties in with AI, but journalistic integrity. I think that we don't have enough as far as the type of information that gets put out and be accurate. I think that we need to have more rules and regulations around that, because how can you have fair elections if you don't have accurate information?
10 seconds.
Workforce development and education and training for our state to be ready for the future.
Representative Colin Wellenkamp represents a portion of St. Charles County in the Missouri House. Representative, thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you so much, Jason.
And State Representative Marty Joe Murray represents a part of the city of St. Louis in the Missouri House.
Thanks for having me.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wysentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.